Okay, I've reviewed a lot of these films so far in video format, so I didn't want to go and capture the footage again, so this one's just going to be a podcast. Now, I've reviewed these Star Wars films several times, and it seems that every time I put in my 2 cents, I get a lot of viewers who crucify me for my opinions on the prequel trilogy. What these people don't seem to realize is that regardless of what your points of view are, it will always be opinion. And it's not like I don't agree with what people say about the prequels. Sure, they're flawed, and they don't always live up to the originals. No one will ever persuade me to dislike them. I've reviewed Phantom Menace in depth, and also touched upon the whole saga in my Star Wars vs. Star Trek video. However, there's a certain reviewer on this site, no names please, who has recently done a far better job of nitpicking the prequels, and while I enjoyed his analysis and agreed with much of what was said, I still consider it nitpicking. And I believe the more you nitpick a movie, the less you'll enjoy it. Okay, that's not always true, but think back to when you were forced to watch a film in class. You sit there analyzing the entire film, picking it apart until there's nothing left to analyze. The next time you go to casually watch the movie in question, do you look at it the same way ever again? I'm still of the opinion that, as many flaws that exist in the prequel trilogy, there are still many more things to actually enjoy about them. This is coming from someone who has seen their share of shitty films. We all have. So are any of the prequels truly horrible, or do they simply fail to meet our expectations as Star Wars fans, proving that George Lucas has gone from a humble filmmaking legend to money-making fiend who controls all of Hollywood? It's really no secret that I fucking love George Lucas. Growing up, I admit it was strictly because of my compassion for the Holy Trilogy. However, after reading a very rewarding book simply titled The Cinema of George Lucas, I realized just how much of a visionary he is. And don't get me wrong, I didn't really understand his boring yet visually groundbreaking tone poem THX 1138, nor did I really enjoy the severely dated collection of old-school rock and roll jazz that composed his highly praised opus American Graffiti. But as a pioneer for how movies were made, there really is no one quite like him. He's the guy I would most try to emulate if I had a film career. Also, consider this. I didn't really appreciate the Star Wars films as a kid. Sure, I remember being impressed by the visuals, but I also appreciated a movie with a story, and Star Wars at the time was way over my head. I didn't really get into the films until the mid-90s, around the time they released the unaltered films one last time, before the special editions came out. I got into the trilogy in 1995, and so I really only had to wait 4 years to see Phantom Menace. However, I was well aware that the original trilogy always started with episodes 4, 5, and 6, and that there was talk that Lucas was going to revive the series with a set of prequels. This was one of the reasons why I got into Star Wars, was that I just thought the idea of this large backstory to a hugely successful franchise was fascinating. And I understood that the prequels weren't just going to be about a younger Luke Skywalker, but that it would delve even further into the Star Wars mythos, as it talked about Anakin and his relationship to Obi-Wan. I admit I'm a little more accepting of these prequels just because I am a Star Wars fan, and the idea of there being a bad Star Wars movie just never crossed my mind. I remember when I first saw Episode 1, even after the credits rolled, that there never really was any true feeling of resentment or disappointment. Sure, it was a more complex film in terms of plot, and it had a very different feel given the nature of the effects, the locations, and the abundance of over-the-top costumes. But generally, it was really cool. I just saw the film again recently, and I have to be honest, I was really looking for reasons to hate it, but the Star Wars fan in me really liked it. It doesn't hold a candle to the other installments, but as a simple, fun fantasy film, I'm generally entertained by it. So for the record, here are my final thoughts on the prequels, as well as some of the enhancements with the special editions and DVD releases of the original films. Phantom Menace is all about the taxation of trade routes, a greedy trade federation, and 2 Jedi Knights who try to save a queen's people from starvation. It has a lot of political undertones, which I don't really think is necessary in a Star Wars film. I really never understood how the taxation of trade routes worked and why it was a necessary plot device. I was also confused by the Queen having a decoy. I knew that Natalie Portman was supposed to be Queen Amidala, but I had a hard time figuring out if she was supposed to be the Queen or a simple handmaiden. Again, it was an unnecessary and mainly confusing plot device that I thought could have been left out altogether, or better explained. As it stands, she doesn't reveal that she has a decoy until the end of the film, so it wasn't very believable. The 2 main characters, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, really aren't that bad. I'm still a little annoyed that all the Jedi, with the exception of Yoda, speak in monotones. Palpatine has the same problem, and so does Padme. No one really seems to care much about their delivery, and I don't really blame this on Lucas. The best actors shouldn't need a director to tell them how to act in front of a camera, regardless of how much green screen there might be. I loved Ewan McGregor in the role of a young Obi-Wan, and while a lot of fans gripe at his inconsistency with the older, wiser character that Alec Guinness portrayed, I never once lingered on it. I couldn't really find a reason for Qui-Gon aside from the whole master-apprentice code that the Jedi followed. As great of an actor as Liam Neeson is, I felt he could have brought a lot more to the character. And I really thought Natalie Portman was poorly cast in this trilogy. She was the only actor who didn't show any improvement throughout the trilogy. I wanted to like her, but her screen presence, her personality, and her overall delivery left a lot to be desired. It was hard to accept given that she becomes Luke and Leia's mother. As far as Senator Palpatine, Ian McDiarmid had a really hard balancing act to play. He had to play the wise, somewhat deceitful senator, as well as a dark, generally mysterious entity known as Darth Sidious. Even the most casual Star Wars fan could tell that Palpatine and Sidious are one and the same, but I felt that his character could have been handled with a little more subtlety. I felt if anything, Palpatine could have used more screen time, and Sidious could have used far less. And Darth Maul, as cool as his design was, just wasn't very fleshed out. I always felt he was just an excuse to create more Star Wars toys. And finally, we get to Anakin Skywalker. I was generally intrigued by the fact that he starts off as a slave on Tatooine, although it's always been hard to choke down that he actually built C-3PO as a mechanical housekeeper for his mother. I also never liked Jake Lloyd, having seen his stale performance in Jingle All the Way. I hated his scenes in outer space, even when I first saw them in the trailers, and he was really annoying overall. For this reason, I really thought the character should have started out a little older, say, maybe at 15. It would have made the whole age dilemma thing with the Jedi more believable, and honestly, it would have made for a more dynamic character. As far as the computer-generated characters go, I really enjoyed them more than the live-action characters. The thing was, most of them had no real function in the story. Jar Jar, who I liked despite his annoying mannerisms, just kind of stumbles around looking for something to do. Jabba just seems like a pointless homage to the original trilogy, and the character I hated the most was Boss Nass, who seemed to really be a waste of animation simply because he did that flabby headshake thing. It stood out and was an unnecessary distraction. Watto actually did serve a purpose in the story, and despite what everyone says, I would really like to think that his speech was not purposely molded from that of a stereotypical Jewish person. I guess I can kind of understand why people say that, but do you realize how offensive that sounds to an actual Jewish person? In terms of the effects, CGI really doesn't bother me. Don't get me wrong, I love the stop-motion and traditional motion-controlled cameras from the original trilogy, but I also believe that CGI allows the filmmaker to do a lot more with a fictional setting. I loved how every scene had images moving around. It really made me feel like I was part of an actual world. Sure, a lot of it was distracting, but I thought that was the point. If we could actually visit far-off places like that, everything would seem distracting. I thought it was a pretty valid attempt to pull us into a completely different world. Everything from the spaceships to the starfights to the lightsaber duels was awesome. My only gripe was the battle between the droid army and the Gungans, which I always felt looked more like a Pixar animated film and kind of took me out of the movie for a while. The biggest flaw of this film is the actual story. A Star Wars film really has two responsibilities. It has to stand on its own for people who've never seen one of these films before, but it also has to fill a piece of a puzzle in fulfilling a part of a greater whole. I didn't really feel that Phantom Menace did either one. You would think that as a prequel there wouldn't be a lot of exposition, given that it's the first chapter in the story. However, Menace seems to have more exposition than any of the other films before it. It explains things that don't really need explaining, like the laws of the Jedi Order and how midichlorians work, and fails to talk about what a Jedi is, how a lightsaber works, and what a Sith is. These, I felt, were the more critical story points that were ignored in favor of explaining things that fans never really cared about. Did anyone really ever wonder what the Senate looked like in the older films? I felt the politics should really have been more in the background like they were in the originals, and more attention should have been placed on the characters. That being said, are you wondering after all the nitpicking I just did why I still like The Phantom Menace? Well, it reminds me of the fun I had watching the original films as a kid. It's fun, fast-paced, and introduces a lot of new characters. It doesn't really do much to further the story of the entire saga, but as a standalone film, I have fun watching it. Generally, I find myself griping at short-lived occurrences, only to be quickly blown away by the rest of it. It's an unbalanced film, sure, and I felt Lucas could have made better story decisions that ultimately made it feel more connected to the originals. But it still really isn't a bad film, especially when you don't try so hard to find flaws while trying to compare it to the timeless classics. Attack of the Clones, on the other hand, was the first time I felt kind of let down by a Star Wars movie. Don't get me wrong, I liked it a lot more than Phantom Menace because it drew more connections to the originals. It felt more like a Star Wars film. But it also seemed to carry the same flaws. There was a lot of political jargon, unnecessary characters, and it felt a little longer than it needed to be. Generally, the Obi-Wan parts of the story are really good and almost on par with the originals. The part of the film that kind of ruined it for me was, not surprisingly, the chemistry between Anakin and Padme. Everything people say about this forced romance I pretty much agree with. The whole film, Padme genuinely rejects Anakin, seemingly uninterested in anything more than a platonic friendship. Finally, when things seem most desperate, she tells him that she loves him. It feels more like a move of last-minute desperation than one of passion. The dialogue is pretty bad between the two, and I also never liked the waterfall scene where Padme is talking about a former love interest while at the same time discussing Anakin's political views. We shouldn't be focused on Padme's past boyfriends, but rather her feelings for Anakin. And I'm not even saying that their romance should be as subtle as Leia's and Han's. It shouldn't be as subtle because these two eventually spawn Luke and Leia, but they just never really seem to make a deep connection beyond friends, and was one part of the film that definitely deserved several rewrites. But honestly, everything else about the film is great. The action, the overall story revolving the clone army, and the last act resulting in the start of the Clone Wars is completely on par with the original trilogy. Sure, some might say that the action is long and pointless, considering the structures of the original films, but come on, it's war. War generally doesn't have structure. Stop looking so much into it. If I really had to nitpick, I never understood how the whole separatist thing started. I still don't like the idea of Padme having a decoy, and I didn't understand the point of Zam Wesell, the bounty hunter that Jango sends to assassinate Padme. Why would a bounty hunter send another bounty hunter to do his work for him? Again, it felt like a reason to develop another toy. And plus, Zam Wesell turns out to be a changeling. She can morph into anyone she wants to. This idea has been used several times. The one that comes to mind is a character from Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. It's a very unoriginal concept. I would have liked to see more from Count Dooku because as a guy who dictates the action of the Separatists, he wasn't all that threatening. In fact, he seemed almost civil. But these are very minor flaws, they don't last more than a few minutes on screen, and I really think that the pros outweigh the cons here. I've said it before that Revenge of the Sith is my favorite overall film in the saga. I know I'll get a lot of pissed off fanboys telling me what an unholy asshole I am for saying this, but keep in mind that as a typical moviegoer who really isn't that big on Star Wars anymore, that's my choice based on its epic story and character development. If I was really big on Star Wars, I would probably say either Empire or Jedi are my favorites, since I loved watching them as a kid. But when I look at the entire saga, this third movie is really what cements the films as a really great piece of cinema. I felt the story was generally more condensed, the characters were finally up to par, the tone was as dark as it needed to be, and it really didn't have very many flaws aside from the general nitpicking. Some people might say that it's due to a certain amount of low expectation that people tended to gravitate toward this one, but having liked the first two films, I was hyped about this one. I didn't expect it to be as good as it was, and that's because I spoiled the film for myself by actually reading the ho-hum graphic novel adaptation. I also read the novel, which I felt left out a lot of key moments in the film. Neither one had a lot of action, and neither one involved the actual transformation of Darth Vader, which I felt was good enough reason to give the movie a PG-13 rating. The chief villain, a half-alien, half-droid named General Grievous, was really interesting and was actually threatening. He reminded me of the intense nature of Darth Maul, but Grievous actually has a key role to the plot. He commands the entire droid army. If the Jedi can bring him down, then the war will come to an end. However, the Jedi also have to deal with Palpatine's hunger for power and getting him to relinquish command of the Senate. Aside from very few faults, this one is incredible. It has some of the most memorable scenes in the saga. Anakin killing the Jedi children, the clones turning on the Jedi Masters, and Obi-Wan telling Padme that even though he knows Anakin is the father of her babies, he still has to kill him. We also actually see the exact moment where the Republic becomes an empire, which I felt was the only time politics should have been introduced as a major plot point. There are a few bad scenes, but honestly, nothing worth griping about. The worst scene is where Padme and Anakin talk about how much they're still in love. I also never cared for how Padme dies, which is due to the fact that she no longer wants to live. I thought Anakin's submission to the dark side happened a bit too easily, and it's hard to buy the fact that after going out of his way to protect Padme, he almost chokes her to death. And I simply loved the end battle between Obi-Wan and Anakin. There were a few pointless shots, but it was truly badass. I've heard people try to compare this scene to the more subtle, dialogue-driven battle between Luke and Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi. However, you can't compare that, a fairly simple battle that takes place in a hallway, with a more frantic battle that takes place on a lava planet where everything quite literally goes to hell. There's simply more at stake in this battle, and their fight is intercut with Yoda's fight with the Emperor, which for some reason no one talks about. Even John Williams' score is a cut above the rest. Well, maybe for the exception of The Empire Strikes Back, but it's close. Everything about this film kicks ass. Now, there's nothing I can say about the original trilogy that hasn't been said, so I'll be brief. I've always liked the originals ever since I got into them in the 90s. Even as a kid, I thought they were alright, but like any other kid, I was more intrigued by the dazzling light shows than the story and characters. I tend to gravitate toward the special editions, especially when it comes to the improved space battles, namely the Battle of Yavin in Episode 4. There are a few flaws, such as Greedo shooting first, which never bothered me as much as it bothered everyone else. The scene just looks unrealistic because of how they tried to make it work. I'm also a little leery with the Jabba sequences cut back in because it seems repetitive. Han just had the exact same conversation with Greedo just minutes before, and it also detracts from the mystery of who Jabba is. Originally, we kept hearing about this Jabba the Hutt in both Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, but we never really saw him until Return of the Jedi. All of a sudden, we're seeing him in Star Wars, and he's regurgitating the same speech that Greedo gave, just before shooting first. Personally, I liked all the little digital touches as it made the films feel a little more up-to-date, but I can understand how some would consider them to be distractions. As far as the DVD releases go, I can understand why George decided to bring the original trilogy closer to the prequels by adding even more changes, but these are more distracting to me. Replacing the original Emperor with Ian McDiarmid, replacing Boba Fett's original voice with Jango Fett's voice, placing Hayden Christensen at the end of Return of the Jedi, even touching up the digital Jabba the Hutt in A New Hope, I just wish they'd leave well enough alone. Anyways, I know I've touched on these things before, but I just had to set the record straight. As much as I love these films, they do have their flaws, and I just didn't want people to think that I'm ignoring them just because I'm a self-fulfilling Star Wars purist. And I honestly love nitpicking movies, but honestly, if a movie has more redeeming factors than stupid little flaws, chances are I'll enjoy it regardless.